A few short months ago, this would have been a patient, critical moment for Boris Johnson's political career. He'd promised to come back to the House of Commons if he was fined. He's been fined. Here he was here today, but somehow the atmosphere wasn't quite as challenging as it might have been, and the conflict in Ukraine has a lot to do with that. Boris Johnson opened his statement with it. He actually spent 2/3 of his statement talking about Ukraine, even though this was meant to be the moment when he came back and talked about Partygate. A lot of loyal backbenchers took the hint there, and they also, when they intervened supportively, talked about Ukraine. But it may not always be dominating the headlines the way it is today. And another factor will pass, and that's the fact that all those MPs know that we're 2.5 weeks away from local elections. Councillors are the activists who keep their associations buoyant. They don't want to undermine their local election campaigns on any grounds. So those factors may move, may not be present if Boris Johnson were, as one senior whip was saying to backbenchers, to probably get 2 or 3 more fixed penalty notices. Now, if that were to happen, they might also be not fixed penalty notices circumstances which some MPs feel quite so comfortable defending. And another factor watching the House of Commons today that will leave some, I think, a little uneasy in number 10 tonight, the way the Tory benches thinned out. Most of the questions in the second half of the session came from the opposition benches. There weren't actually supportive Tories there. They'd actually drifted out of the chamber. That will worry them, but the biggest worry right now, the immediate one, you talked about that vote coming up on Thursday. Tories are putting a 3-line whip on that. Some Tory MPs will bristle at that. They won't want to be forced into voting with the government on that. They've got to find a way through on Thursday. And the other big problem, again and again, the headlines keep coming up on the story they actually want buried: Partygate. The fine the Prime Minister has now paid for attending a birthday gathering in the Cabinet room during lockdown was compared by one Cabinet Minister this morning to a speeding ticket. In the Commons, Boris Johnson tried to strike a different note.
As soon as I received the notice, I acknowledged the hurt and the anger. And I said that people had a right to expect better of their Prime Minister. It did not occur to me then or subsequently that a gathering in the Cabinet room just before a vital meeting on COVID strategy could amount to a breach of the rules. I repeat, that was my mistake, and I apologise for it unreservedly. It is precisely because I know that so many people are angry and disappointed that I feel an even greater sense of obligation to deliver on the priorities of the British people and to respond in the best traditions of our country to Putin's barbaric onslaught against Ukraine.
The Prime Minister spent 2/3 of his statement talking about Ukraine, but the Labour leader was not diverted to that topic.
What a joke. Even now, as the latest mealy-mouthed apology stumbles out of one side of his mouth, a new set of deflections and distortions pour from the other. But the damage is already done. The public have made up their mind. They don't believe a word the Prime Minister says. He knows he's dishonest and incapable of changing. So he drags everybody else down with him.
Tory MPs objected, and the Speaker said dishonest was not parliamentary language.
I respect that ruling from the Chair. The Prime Minister knows what he is.
Speaker, but I think it would have been a good thing if, in the course of his remarks, he had addressed some of the issues that I mentioned, not least the crisis in Ukraine.
There was no such problem with some of his own backbenchers.
Yes, someone needs to have the courage to get rid of the leader. The leader who is sitting in the Kremlin and causing the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent people.
This Prime Minister is leading the world against Putin's aggression in Ukraine.
Opposition MPs drowned him out. But one former Tory chief whip chose this moment to put in a letter saying, "I no longer have confidence in Boris Johnson as leader of this party."
I regret to say that we have a Prime Minister who broke the laws that he told the country they had to follow, hasn't been straightforward about it, and is now going to ask the decent men and women on these benches to defend what I think is indefensible. I'm very sorry to have to say this, but I no longer think he is worthy of the great office that he holds.
Well, I must say to my right honourable friend, I know the care and the sincerity with which he weighs his words, and I bitterly regret what has happened. I bitterly regret.
A few months ago, the Prime Minister would have had to deal with many more voices like that. Today, he was spared them. But the voices behind him, standing to ask supportive questions, dried up, and the government benches thinned out early. There could be more statements in the House, potentially, if the Prime Minister faces more fixed penalty notices for other Downing Street gatherings. They could come when Ukraine is not so prominent in the news, and Tory MPs' attention has switched to the domestic scene and polling evidence, neither of which may be looking in good shape for them by then.
Well, joining me now from the House of Parliament is Northern Ireland Minister Conor Burns. Conor Burns, you heard the Prime Minister repeatedly apologising. Do you feel just a little bit gullible believing him?
No, Cathy, I saw a Prime Minister who was contrite. I lost count of the number of times the Prime Minister apologised throughout that statement. I saw a Prime Minister who was acknowledging the hurt and anger of the public, and a Prime Minister who was asking the public, in a sense, asking the House of Commons, and through the House of Commons, the British people, for an opportunity to move on, an opportunity to show what this government can still do for them in their daily lives and the challenges that face us in cost of living, energy, and so on, rebuilding the National Health Service after the pandemic, as well as the dreadful situation unfolding in the east of Europe.
So if he's that sorry about one fine, if there are more fines, he'd have to quit, would he?
Well, Cathy, I think the Prime Minister was very clear that he, at all times, was honest in what he told Parliament. It's clear that on some of the things that he said, what subsequently emerged added further detail to that. And the Prime Minister was very clear after the initial Sue Gray report that there needed to be a change in the way that Number 10 worked and the structures of Number 10 to increase the discipline and organisation and information flow within Number 10. The Prime Minister has taken those actions. He was very clear that it didn't occur to him at the time or subsequently that what happened that day in the Cabinet room fell foul of those rules, but he in no way resiles from the findings of the Met, which is why he paid the fixed penalty notice immediately.
So he accepts, and you accept that he inadvertently misled the House?
Well, I accept that what the Prime Minister told the House in good faith, when further information came forth, he had to update the House, and today he was very clear. He apologises for what happened in the Cabinet room that day, which the Met have found to be in breach of those rules, but I do not believe at any time the Prime Minister acted other than in good faith with the House. I don't believe the Prime Minister at any point during this process willingly or knowingly misled the House of Commons.
Right, but he did still mislead the House, whether knowingly or not, and Amber Rudd had to quit as Home Secretary for inadvertently misleading the House. So how come he gets to survive?
Well, Cathy, it's a very important point. If a minister comes to the House of Commons and tells the House of Commons a lie, that is career-ending. If the Prime Minister or any other minister in good faith tells the House of Commons something that then needs to be clarified when further information comes to light, that's a totally different matter altogether. The Prime Minister made it very clear.
Misleading the House was career-ending for Amber Rudd and other ministers,
wasn't it? He apologised repeatedly throughout the statement. He said he understands the hurt and the anger, and it's worth remembering, by the way, this is a Prime Minister who nearly died of COVID himself, who was hospitalised, taken to A&E, suffering from COVID. This is a Prime Minister who, without his actions, without his judgments, on the big judgments, for example, on the vaccine, many people in this country wouldn't be alive today who are alive today because
and
of
so
that vaccine
if there are more
programme.
fines, he'll be even more sorry, will he, and would therefore have to consider his position?
Well, the Prime Minister again was completely clear, and you will understand this. We're standing here in the House of Commons. It would be totally inappropriate for members of Parliament, a minister or the Prime Minister to speculate or to interfere or seek to influence the ongoing investigation of the Metropolitan Police.
Right.
The Prime Minister was very clear that as soon as he got that fixed penalty notice, he paid it, he accepts responsibility for it, he doesn't challenge the decision that the Met reached in their investigation, and they must now get on and finish the task. And of course, when they finish that task, then Sue Gray will update her report, and the Prime Minister, I'm sure, will wish to come back to Parliament willingly to answer further questions.
And the party that he has been fined for is the very one that you came on this programme to defend him over, saying that he'd been ambushed with cake. Do you feel incredibly foolish with that defence now?
Well, look, I made a slightly frivolous remark which spurned an industry. You can now buy baseball caps and hoodies with ambushed by cake on it. The point I was seeking to make is that the Prime Minister on that day had been outside London, returned to London, went to the Cabinet Room, and there was an impromptu gathering for his birthday. The Chancellor's also been fined for turning up to a meeting while that event was going on. The Prime Minister said again today that he did not think, either then or subsequently, that that could be a breach of the rules, but he fully accepts the decision of the Metropolitan Police that that was a breach of the rules, which is why he has paid the fixed penalty notice, accepted responsibility for it, and apologised yet again to the British people. But he is asking the people for the opportunity to show what this government can do to deliver on the cost of living, rebuilding the National Health Service, and allow him to continue to play that role that he's been playing in marshalling and leading the international efforts against Putin to support President Zelensky and his people in Ukraine.
Conor Burns, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Cathy.